what was your journey to this career?
I started out, as a music fan as a kid. Both my parents played keyboards and piano. So like in the second grade or somewhere, I started taking piano lessons and fell in love with music. Eventually switched to saxophone in middle school so I could play in the band. And then somewhere around that time, I was a big video game computer nerd. And started to learn that there was, sort of whole music production side of it, using computers and software and stuff. So I think middle school into high school, I started to dabble with home recording software and, whatever I could find online, download those things, record stuff, start to edit things, and kind of realize that I love the kind of combination of music and technology. So eventually went to Berklee College of Music in Boston for music production, and at the same time was a huge fan of film music, television music, video game music. Wasn't sure for, part of the time I wanted to be a composer, part of me wanted to be a sound designer, and then I kind of realized that really mixing engineering was my forte. So for doing that for film music just sounded like the perfect combination. So I moved out to LA in 2010 to pursue that, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So a lot of people don't really understand what sound mixing is. Can you start to give the elevator pitch of what sound mixing is, what you do?
Yeah, so for me, composers are all my clients. So they hire me to come in, and hopefully we have a budget to record an orchestra like we did on Star Trek Picard. So that's where my job starts, is deciding where to place microphones, being at the session, moving things around, setting levels, and kind of getting a really solid recording down. And then I take that recording and bring it back to my studio at home and blend it with all of the electronic elements that the composers have created in their software. And I'm really just sort of blending them together, getting a final polish and everything, usually mixing in surround sound as well, which, most composers work in stereo, so that's part of my job as well, is to get a really good solid surround mix of the music so we can deliver that to the final stage where they mix the music, the dialogue, and the sound effects. And I'm sort of just prepping it so that it sounds as best it can, so they don't have to worry about the music of the dub as much.
Yeah. So when you're working on something like Star Trek, so that has a huge fan base and a whole history, when you're working on the music in general, do you sort of look to past Star Trek things, or how do you handle something like that?
For this one, certainly. I mean, sometimes I'll get references on other projects, but this one for sure. Before we started, I was listening to Next Generation soundtrack, the original series, the original movie, and then certainly, Next Generation through, Nemesis was sort of the period that we were really drawing a lot from. So that was mostly, the movies are all Jerry Goldsmith for the most part, and James Horner, and just big, epic, wet orchestral recordings, lots of reverb. So I was kind of using that as a reference because that's really what Terry was asking for, because he really knows a lot about music and about music production, which is really fun.
What are some of the differences between mixing for film, TV versus video games?
Video games, I'd say the only thing these days is different is sometimes I'll mix a little bit louder for video games. I worked on some Call of Duty games in the past, and they want that music to really punch through all of the guns, battles, and explosions and stuff going on. Whereas film, they're going to be mixing it linearly, whereas in video games, everything's programmed and kind of has to sort of auto mix itself based on different events and things like that. So just kind of a little more compression, a little more loudness on the music for video games often.
And then when you're doing the video games, how do you balance the effects, the dialogue, the music, the sound? How does that work?
Video games, that's I guess one of the big differences there is usually I don't have any of that stuff. Unlike when I'm working on a TV show or a film, I have the rough dialogue and the rough sound effects that I kind of can listen to and know what's going on. Whereas video games, I'm just mixing the music on its own, because they're going to take it, they're going to program it into the game later after I make everything sound its best. Sometimes I'll get a video clip of like someone playing the game just to give the vibe, but in general, a lot of times I'm just like Diablo, I didn't have anything, I just mixed the music on its own.
So when you started working on Picard, were you a Star Trek fan?
Somewhat. I was more of a Star Wars kid growing up, but I did my research, especially after it was a slog, but I watched all of Next Generation, all was it 7 seasons. And then the 4 movies before I watched the series after it came out. So it was fun for me to actually when I was watching the series and the movies, I was recognizing themes I had recorded for the show. I was like, oh, that's where that comes from. Well, that's where that one comes from. But I grew up with seeing it on TV, and friends would be watching Next Generation or Voyager or Deep Space Nine. So a lot of it's in my subconscious for sure.
Are there any projects that you've worked on where you had been fans before you started working on the project?
Not at this level, no. Yeah. So it's kind of like fun to, it's the first big franchise, I'd say, that I really dove into, that I really knew a lot about ahead of time.
Do you have a preference working TV, movies, or video games?
I used to always say, I got into this really for films, because when I grew up, film was sort of the, primary medium. But these days, TV has really just come a long way in being much more cinematic and much more sort of epic in the storytelling. It's not just sitcoms anymore. I mean, stories are being told on TV that you really couldn't do in film because you have so much more time. So I've been honored to work on some really, really cool TV shows.
Do you have a favorite genre to mix for?
I mean, definitely the sort of general sound of Picard that's what I grew up with. That's what I know best. Just the big, expensive, well-balanced kind of hi-fi sound that we got on that is kind of what I gravitate towards. But it's always fun with something like Diablo or like Ozark to kind of test myself in mixing things that are darker and grungier and kind of not very good sounding per se, because they're supposed to be kind of mangled and kind of weird, so it's a good challenge.
That's cool. If you weren't doing sound mixing, what do you think you'd be doing?
Probably flying. My original dream as a kid was to be a pilot, so I'd probably be a pilot.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. This is fun.